Hello and welcome. My name is Mary Ray Perry, and I am Director of Alumni Networks with the Washington University Alumni Association. Before we begin, I'd like to explain the format for today's session. You will only hear and see me, our moderator, our presenter, and her slides. Our presentation will last about 1 hour. Following the presentation, Professor John Klein will moderate a discussion with Stephanie. At that time, we will get to as many questions from the audience as possible. We encourage you to participate by asking questions. To do that, type a question in the Q&A box at any time during the talk. The webinar is being recorded, and we will share it on the Alumni Association YouTube channel and on our website following the event. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Professor John Klein. John Klein is a professor of art history and archaeology at Washington University. The primary focus of his research is on European art on the first half of the 20th century. Professor Klein is an internationally known specialist in the art of Henri Matisse. In addition to his first book, Matisse Portraits, he has published many articles and book chapters on the artist. His recent book, Matisse in Decoration, published by Yale in 2018, is a comprehensive analysis of the concept of decoration in Matisse's art, with a particular focus on his commissions for ceramic tile, stained glass, tapestry, and other fabrics, and decorative objects and paintings during the last 20 years of his career. Professor Klein is currently working on a book of essays on modern portraiture. We are proud and grateful to welcome Professor John Klein to this evening's event.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much, Mary Ray. I'm very pleased to be doing this to introduce our speaker, but I want to express two regrets. First, one is that I have not seen the Winslow Homer Crosscurrents exhibition now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which is the subject of Stephanie Herdrich's talk today. And the other regret is that I've never met Stephanie. She graduated from Washington University several years before I arrived in St. Louis, so we missed each other without knowing it. And it gives me pleasure to make contact with her now and to hear what she has to say about Winslow Homer, long one of my favorite American artists. And by the way, Stephanie, I was an Americanist until I was in graduate school in London. But I studied American art pretty intensively as an undergraduate, especially 19th century art. So let me tell you a little bit about Stephanie. She is the associate curator of American painting and sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. After graduating from WashU with an undergraduate degree in art history in 1990, she received her master's degree from New York University in New York City and began her career as an intern at the Met, where she has worked for more than 15 years. And I do happen to know what the kind of career track that you can have if you've been an intern at the Met, because my wife was an intern at the Met, and it was the beginning of her illustrious career. And also several museum directors of our acquaintance were interns at the Met. So it's a great stepping stone. Stephanie is an expert in the work of John Singer Sargent, another of my favorite American artists, who was the subject of her doctoral dissertation, also at NYU in 2016. And she's the author of two books featuring her research on John Singer Sargent. She is co-curator with Sylvia Yount of the Metropolitan Museum of Art of the exhibition Winslow Homer Crosscurrents, the largest critical overview of Homer's career since 1995. And it's going to be at the Met through July 21st, 2022. And then, extraordinarily, it moves to London, a European site for a monographic exhibition of an American artist. This is very unusual, I must say. It's going to be at the National Gallery in London from September 2022 through early 2023. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Stephanie, and I look forward to hearing what we're going to learn about Winslow Homer.
Thank you so much, Professor Klein. It's so lovely to be here this evening, and I look forward to meeting you in person sometime soon. I hope all of you will have a chance to come to New York and see our Winslow Homer exhibition. We are just thrilled to have it up in the main galleries at the Met. And I'm going to start by, let me share my screen. Excellent. It's really been my great pleasure to work on this exhibition over the past 5 years with my co-curator, Sylvia Yunt, as John said, also of the Met. This is an exhibition that was very much inspired by the Met's collection of Homer's works. And here, I'm just giving you a glimpse into the exhibition galleries here at the heart of the museum. The exhibition was inspired by the Met's collection of Homer's works. We have over 40 watercolors and paintings by the artist, several drawings, and many, many prints in our Department of Drawings and Prints. And at the heart of the exhibition is this epic painting by Homer, The Gulf Stream. This is a painting that embodies the key themes of Homer's art. But in the exhibition, we're really focusing on the theme of conflict. Homer's art is well known in the 19th century. He was one of the great American painters, celebrated for his images of the American Civil War, for documenting American life in the late 19th century, and really well known for his images of the coast of Maine. But this exhibition centers his career on the Gulf Stream in the tropics, focusing away from this kind of New England-centric version of the great painter. Homer's epic saga focuses on a lone Black protagonist aboard a dismasted, distressed boat along the Atlantic Ocean current. It's, as we say, a veritable catalog of disasters. The sharks are circling, the storm is on the horizon, the ocean is swelling, and all the while this man is unaware of his only possible source of rescue, the boat on the upper horizon. This is a painting that's always been intriguing to me. It's long considered one of Homer's most complicated and consequential paintings. And by putting it at the heart of our exhibition, we wanted to explore its place in Homer's art. And as I said, refocus his work away from New England. Homer himself was greatly interested in the ocean. Of course, he makes it one of his signature themes, painting from his studio along the coast of Maine for many, many decades across his career. But we are also focusing Homer's career on the Gulf Stream current, inspired by the painting to sort of center his work in the Atlantic world and thinking about the places that were central to his art. Homer traveled widely, visiting the Bahamas twice, visiting Cuba, making many trips to Florida, the Florida Keys, painting all along the eastern seaboard of the United States, in the North Atlantic, and visiting Europe on 2 occasions. So again, focusing on this oceanic frontier as the location of some of his most profound, important paintings, and again, the central themes of his art, embodying conflict. And this map that I'm showing you on the screen is a map from a book from the mid-1850s, Matthew Maury's Physical Geography of the Sea. Maury was a pioneering oceanographer who had a role in mapping the Gulf Stream currents. Of course, the Gulf Stream was first mapped by Benjamin Franklin a century earlier, but Maury's writings, Maury's books were well known to Homer, and Homer recommended reading Maury's treatise on the ocean and the Gulf Stream for anyone who was interested in it. And we will talk a little bit more about that as we spend time together this evening. And then here is an image of Homer in his studio in Prouts Neck, Maine, around the time he finished the Gulf Stream painting. And it's important to note that this is a painting that Homer did late in his career, around 1900, just 10 years before his death. And we see it as a kind of culminating expression of these key themes, as I said. But by foregrounding it in the exhibition, we are really looking at it through Homer's art, looking at Homer's art through a different lens, and thinking about, we introduce the Gulf Stream from the first vantage points of the exhibition inviting questions about his art and asking you to consider the place of this work in his career as you go through the exhibition. But let's go back to the beginning, just give you a little history and biography of Homer. Homer is born in 1836 outside of Boston. He spends his early career around that city and begins as a commercial illustrator, doing illustrations for this kind of new burgeoning genre of weekly and monthly magazines. In particular, one you would know would be Harper's Weekly. And here you see an early illustration by Homer. This is 1859, August in the country. Homer develops a skill for storytelling and his work as an illustrator. And here you see a blend of genre details, a little bit of humor with that man clutching the lobster. And I think his ability to tell stories in his art comes from this grounding. And he's really engaged in everyday scenes of American life. Here's another beautiful example of an illustration that he did, skating on Central Park, New York. A beautiful design focusing on sports, outdoor activity, really contemporary subjects, and of course, looking a little bit at women and fashion at the same time. Homer is basically self-taught as an artist. He has his foundation in drawing and illustration. He moves to New York City in the late 1850s and does eventually have some lessons in painting at the National Academy of Design, but he's actually reading painting manuals, studying color theory, and basically teaching himself to paint by looking at the examples that he has available to him in New York City. And he really makes great strides quickly. He is sent to the front lines of the Civil War as an special artist correspondent for Harper's Weekly. And he visits the front in Virginia on several occasions. There, he really documents the everyday lives of the soldiers, life around camp. This is a scene you can see from Harper's in 1862, Thanksgiving in camp. He really avoids depicting battles or graphic war scenes. Here's another example of his work, the Union cavalry and artillery starting in pursuit of the rebels up at at Yorktown. His illustrations of the Civil War are sometimes anecdotal, sometimes general, but rarely graphic in the violence of the war. However, Homer is really deeply affected by what he experiences during his time in Virginia and the front line. When he returns from Yorktown, his mother writes in a letter that Homer was so changed by what he saw that his best friends didn't recognize him. And it's this, during this crucible of struggle, that Homer becomes a painter and becomes an artist. And we would argue in the exhibition that the depicting of conflict, the experience of the trauma of war, really shapes him as an artist and is fundamental to his career. And that the conflict that he depicts throughout his career, it has its foundation in his wartime experiences. The work that you see on the screen now is his Sharpshooter from the Portland Museum of Art in Maine. This is Homer's first serious oil painting. It's not a very big thing, maybe 12 by 18 inches. It's an intimate view of a Union sharpshooter perched in a tree. You can see his rifle here. Homer is really commenting on the modern technology of the Civil War, specifically a telescopic lens that allowed a sharpshooter to see and pick off his target from up to a mile away. This is a technology that fundamentally changed warfare. If we think of the sort of combat with bayonets and soldiers charging each other, this, an unsuspecting target could just be picked off out of nowhere. And this kind of imminent threat, the unknown outcome here, the suggestion of something about to happen is something that is becomes very central to Homer's art and his way of telling a story. Homer, this is what he witnessed in these sharpshooters is something that stuck with him. And many years later, he recalled that in a letter some details of the sharpshooters. And here I'm showing you a page from one of his letters. This is from almost 30 years later. He wrote that in a peach orchard at the front in Yorktown in April 1862, he looked through one of these telescopic viewfinders, and you see, this is what I saw, that image of a soldier in the crosshairs of a gun. And he wrote, it was as near to murder as anything I could think of. And again, this culture of death that was so prevalent during the Civil War is something that sticks with Homer and informs his career. And of course, the trauma of the war and the tremendous death toll, upwards of, by some estimates, 750,000 Americans died during the Civil War. So it's safe to say that death was everywhere and left an impression on Homer and the nation as they tried to move on. One of Homer's really remarkable Civil War paintings is this near Andersonville. Andersonville, Georgia, was the site of an infamous Confederate prison. And on the left side of this painting, you can see a group of Confederate soldiers marching with their captured prisoners, a Confederate flag here. And the painting is really remarkable at focusing on this lone Black woman. This is a painting from the height of the war. This woman is enslaved and at a literal and figurative threshold, seemingly pondering her future and the unknown outcome of the war and what that will mean for her. And across Homer's art, his images of Black Americans, Black Caribbean people vary. And this one, I think, is really important as focusing on her interior thoughts, her agency, her interior world. And for him to foreground a Black woman in this period is quite astonishing. Homer's paintings of the Civil War quickly become much more monumental and emblematic. This is a painting, Prisoners from the Front, from the Met's collection. In it, Homer really summarizes the war, the conflict between North and South, as a confrontation between humans and individuals. And on the right, you see a Union general modeled on a friend and acquaintance of Homer, that's General Francis Channing Barlow. And the painting is based on an actual historical event, Barlow's capture of a group of Confederate soldiers near Spotsylvania in 1864. Homer was not there in Virginia at the time, so this is a painting that he is inventing and historicizing. And you see that he, in a way, in a sense, mimics or echoes or mirrors the poses between the general and this Confederate soldier in the center. They are very much at the same level. Their poses mirror each other, suggesting they are alike. And this idea of brothers fighting brothers, North versus South, and the country torn apart was a really popular notion at the time. And I think Homer is suggesting the difficulties of reconciliation ahead, but also kind of the possibility and feelings of hope and optimism as well. And of course, the setting is important. Homer sets this scene against an absolutely devastated southern landscape. You can see there's not any greenery. The trees have all been wasted. It's brown and just barren. And Homer's interest in the effects of the war on not only the soldiers, the formerly enslaved, but also the landscape. And this relationship between humans and nature becomes a real central theme of Homer's art. This painting, The Veteran in a New Field, is another painting from the Met's collection. And this is painted just at the end of the war in the spring and summer of 1865. So just following the assassination of President Lincoln, the surrender of Lee at Appomattox. And it's a painting that speaks, I think, to the hope and the grief in the era following the war. In the lower right corner, you see this veteran has set aside his jacket, his uniform, his Union jacket and canteen, and is returning to work, returning to peaceful pursuits, harvesting wheat that will be used to, I would say, feed the nation. And the lone figure here who's seen from behind, very much becomes an everyman figure, standing in for so many of the soldiers, for so many of the men who fought in the war. This image of the single-bladed scythe evokes very much, I think, imagery of death and the Grim Reaper. And this title, resonant, his new field, reminds us that his old field was the battlefield, and he was very much a harvester of death, though here he is harvesting wheat. And of course, we think of Isaiah and the words from the Bible, they shall beat their swords into plowshares. So very much speaking to hope and regeneration, but also strongly resonating of death and loss at the same time. In a decade after the war, Homer returns to Virginia and paints a series of images focusing on the lives of the formerly enslaved. And one of the most fascinating is this painting, The Cotton Pickers, painted in 1876, so really at the nation's centennial, and Homer is in Virginia. These are most certainly sharecroppers, but Homer's really pondering the future of these women. They are doing the hard work that they have done probably for generations, and they're somehow poised between their past, their present, and their future. And I think it's a beautiful painting, aestheticized image of slavery and the lives of the formerly enslaved. You see this massive cotton field, striking light of the late day. Homer's really studying these women and their expressions, and as they ponder their future. He had been to Europe at this point. He was certainly aware of French peasant art, like works like Millet, showing people working in fields, as we had seen in The Veteran, and he's certainly drawing on that tradition. It's interesting, I think, and important to note that this is a painting that was purchased right after Homer painted and exhibited it by an English cotton merchant, and went across the ocean to England for many years. And so when we look at this painting and can see a kind of aestheticized sensitivity in his renderings of these women, it's interesting to think about what this meant for a British cotton merchant. Certainly something different. And I think that is partly what is fascinating about Homer's work, is the way that it continues to speak to us across time, and some sense of ambiguity that allows us to attach different meanings to it. And I would say also that Homer was very much a man of his time, and across his career, his depictions of Black Americans can range from racial stereotypes to really poignant expressions, to ambivalent depictions. And I think it's interesting and important to consider all of his different approaches across his work. Throughout the 1870s, as the nation is trying to move on and recover from the war, while Homer's painting images of Black Americans, he's also looking at rural life, especially across the Northeast United States. And this is, a painting, The Old Mill, from the Yale University Art Gallery, where Homer is looking at this rural life. This is a scene in the Catskills as these women, the start of their workday in a textile mill, go to work. And I think the woman at center in her bright red clothes seems to don slightly more sophisticated, perhaps urban garb, suggesting that she might be new to economic necessity, and thinking about the years after the war, the absence of men because of this great death toll, and women's new access to public places, their new role in the world, and going out and becoming part of the workforce. And Homer is also at this time painting, for example, school teachers and other women at leisure. Here you see that the beautiful sunlit landscape. Homer has really developed greatly as a painter since his years in the Civil War, moving towards more accurate and beautiful depictions of sunlight, brighter colors, and the sense, in fact, that the landscape has kind of regenerated after the Civil War is evident in these beautiful foregrounds and bright green colors. this painting, Crossing the Pasture, is another work from the early 1870s. And these works by Homer of the 1870s are really some of his most cherished and familiar works, celebrated for their charm, their nostalgia. It's really idyllic images of rural life. And of course, this is at a moment when the country is becoming rapidly urbanized, and Homer is living in New York City, but he never really paints urban life. He's really focusing on the countryside. But we wanted to point out also that in these really beloved, sweet, charming works, that they're often infused with subtle tensions. And in this scene of these two boys crossing the pasture, you notice that they're clinging close to each other, holding tightly to that lunch pail with slightly uneasy expressions on their eyes. And that's because they have likely attracted the attention of this bull near the fence in the back left. And this sense of threat or of nature is evident in so many of these works. And it really foreshadows his interest in nature and depicting humans in nature and the threat of nature across his career. In the 1870s, Homer really begins to experiment with watercolor. And I should say that this exhibition has 88 works in it, and more than half of them are watercolors. Homer was an extremely accomplished watercolorist, I would say, certainly one of the best of the 19th century, perhaps of all time. And in these early works, he paints the same subjects, children at play. These are all done in Gloucester, Massachusetts, where he visits in 1873. And you see him very much hewing to his background as an illustrator, drawing carefully, attentive to detail, and then filling the sheets in with watercolor. Homer's living at a moment in time in the 1870s where watercolor is becoming an important medium for artists, previously thought of as an activity or pastime for women or amateurs or school children. It's becoming a really legitimate mode of artistic expression, and Homer really excels in it in his career. And he had been encouraged to paint in watercolor by his mother. And these two images of children near the shore are, I think, also contain those subtle tensions in nature, where on the right, you see these two children pillaging the sand dunes, nests of the bank swallow, stealing eggs from the sand dunes. And the work on the left is Waiting for Dad, also known as Longing, where this young child waits for his father to return from sea. And that sort of sense of unknown anticipation we see in so many of these works. One of the culminating paintings of this decade is this painting, Breezing Up from the National Gallery, which is a painting that's completed in 1876 at the Nation's Centennial and shown at the fair in Philadelphia. And in fact, the painting had an alternate title called A Fair Wind, punning on the fair in Philadelphia, but also kind of celebrating smooth sailing and stability. And in its time, this painting was very much interpreted as a metaphor for the country at its centennial, moving optimistically in the future. And you see here a group of young boys and a man on a beautiful day in Gloucester, Massachusetts, on smooth seas sailing away. Interestingly, this is a painting that Homer edited. Homer was very reluctant to speak about his paintings, liked to keep private. And sometimes in his edits to a painting, we can get deeper meaning into his intentions and the symbolism of these works. So originally, in sketches and other works related to this painting, Homer had shown the man, the adult, guiding the boat, holding onto the tiller and steering it. But in his edits, he gives control of the boat to the child. And as we're saying, children are very much seen as kind of the optimistic hope for the future of the country. And this painting interpreted as a kind of metaphor, that ship of state sailing into the future in the hands of the youth of the country. In the early 1880s, Homer has another transformative experience. He travels to England, spends some time in London before settling in a North Sea fishing village, Cullercoats. And he spends about 18 months there and becomes really preoccupied with the daily lives of the people who work the sea, the fishermen, and the harsh conditions of the sea. And the range of his experiences there and the art that he makes there are quite interesting. Shortly after he arrived, he witnessed a dramatic sea rescue, which he documented in this drawing, which is called The Wreck of the Iron Crown. And the Iron Crown is the bark that had run aground. And Homer is documenting this scene of distress with his illustrator's attention to detail, recording every oar of the life brigade boat, every little rescuer there. And you can see, perhaps you can see on the deck of the boat, the one figure man who had been left behind waving to his rescuers. There's a very kind of literal interpretation of this rescue scene that Homer is documenting, recording it and kind of, I think, internalizing it. But while he was there, he also did this remarkable painting, The Life Brigade, in which he's kind of pared down this scene into only the most essential elements and details. And you see these rescuers gazing out from the Life Brigade house at a roiling sea. It's an oil sketch, very broadly painted, not the kind of thing he would have exhibited. But in these works, you can kind of see him thinking, working out, paring down, gathering material that he will use in paintings in the future. His most celebrated works from this time in color coats are his watercolors. And he takes a huge leap forward in his watercolor technique, having studied British watercolor while in London, probably studying Greco-Roman art at the British Museum. His figures take on a new monumentality. His paintings are much more accomplished with broad washes of color. But these works are also remarkable for celebrating kind of the strength and fortitude of these fisherwomen. Homer in the town of Color Coats was very much stuck on shore daily when the men went out to sea, and he begins painting the women of the town as they wait for their men to return, as they're mending nets or gathering fish. And this work called Inside the Bar really kind of celebrates that strength and fortitude against nature and the harshness of nature. When he returns to the United States, his work takes a kind of darker tone, and the threat of nature, the danger of nature is something that really begins to preoccupy him. And this is a painting called The Lifeline from the mid-1880s. And it's based on a rescue scene that Homer seems to have witnessed off the coast of Atlantic City, New Jersey. It's using a kind of modern technology called a breeches buoy, which is a rope and pulley system in which people could be rescued from a distressed boat. And at the left, you see the indication of the boat in trouble with the sails, the rope, of course, extending to the shore or another boat. And this remarkable scene of a man and a woman, the woman semi-conscious, unconscious, being rescued by this kind of anonymous rescuer as her red scarf kind of covers his face. And again, the rescuer becomes this kind of surrogate figure, which we see a lot in Homer's works, where one could kind of project themselves into the painting. But it's almost a kind of, there's a lot of drama to the scene. It's almost been calling it a kind of Victorian melodrama, the woman who seems to be swooning. You see the glimpse of her bare knees. It is filled with drama, adventure, and a sense of danger. And we, the viewer, are witnessing it from this kind of ambiguous spot over the water. And the swelling waves kind of foreshadow Homer's increasing interest in painting the sea and the threats of the sea. In this time, he also paints a series of interesting paintings showing the lives of the North Atlantic fishermen and really kind of celebrating their heroic work. This is one of a series of 3 paintings which show kind of varying degrees of drama and threat. This is kind of the middle painting of a series, a painting called The Fog Warning from the MFA in Boston. And here you see this fisherman, he's got a couple of large halibut in his little dory, and he's gazing back towards the horizon as the fog rolls in, and kind of this moment of limbo where he's wondering if he can get back to that larger ship before the fog comes in. So this, again, a sense of imminent danger, of nature's threat, tension and unknown outcomes in paintings like this. In the mid 1880s, Homer, who had been living in New York City, moves to the coast of Maine, to Prouts Neck, and settles into a studio that is just yards away from the rocky cliffs. And it's in these years that he really becomes preoccupied with depicting the sea and the powers of the sea. And I should mention, when we're looking at the fog warning, that Homer didn't travel up to the North Atlantic, the remote North Atlantic, with these fishermen, but really based these paintings on experiences around Prouts Neck, experiences in England. In any case, having settled on the coast of Maine, he discovers what we all know, which is that these harsh Maine winters can be very rough. And it's from this moment in the 1880s that Homer really begins to travel frequently to southern climates in the Caribbean and along the Gulf Stream. He visits the Bahamas twice. He visits Bermuda, as I said, the Florida Keys. And he's just, his work, I think, is transformed by the tropical environments. And the work you're seeing on the screen now is from a trip to the Bahamas in 1884, 1885. Homer is very much a privileged tourist, lured to the tropical climate for its promise of being restorative to his health. He travels there with his father at a moment just following his mother's death. So they're certainly seeking solace, promised by kind of a healthful climate that will restore them. And Homer is just captivated by the tropical environment, the bright sunlight, the vibrancy of the foliage, of the landscape. And this work, Oranges on a Branch, is so just, I think, kind of overtly touristic, but also a complete sensory experience. We sense the warm, bright sunlight. We sense the bright colors, even the fragrance of the orange blossoms here. And it's really one of Homer's only still lifes. And in this kind of remarkable work, he's put the oranges right on the front of the picture plane, as if I think they're kind of ripe for our plucking. And these were watercolors that were very much made for audiences in the Northeast. So Homer travels to these tropical regions, and after his trips really immediately begins exhibiting these works. And they are celebrated for their beauty and their technique, but critics also see them as kind of travel sketches and studies. In fact, one critic who saw them said, they're very nice, but I hope that he'll make some real paintings from these sketches. In the exhibition, we really wanted to foreground these works. Homer saw them as central to his career, as central to his artistic legacy, and they've often been, there has been a tendency to overlook their subjects, and it was really important for us to kind of dig in and recognize that Homer is painting many of the same subjects in watercolor that he paints throughout his career. This is shark fishing, also from his first trip to the Bahamas. And as he had done in the North Atlantic, he's looking at the daily lives of these fishermen as they wrestle this shark. And of course, this is an important precursor to his painting of the Gulf Stream. Homer's really fascinated in the Bahamas with the daily lives of the Bahamians. And this is a work from the Terra Foundation in Chicago, a beautiful garden in Nassau, where Homer really revels in the brilliant tropical landscape, the bright colors, the lushness of this setting. Homer shows a really typical white limestone coral wall of the Bahamas, one that separates the public and private spaces. And we see here just this lone child kind of gazing up at this coconut palm. And I think the sense of kind of isolation and separation are central to this watercolor. And this is a watercolor that Homer edited. I think it's interesting to note that Homer originally included two figures climbing over the wall here as if they were about to pluck the coconuts off the tree. In removing them, editing them out, and filling this in, Homer has left this young child by himself. And I think that sense of isolation and separation, as I said, it kind of speaks to some of the structural racism that was inherent in Bahamian society. Homer also visits Cuba in 1885 at a moment where Cuba is really agitating for independence from Spain. He focuses on aspects of Cuba's colonial history, whether on the right, this beautiful Spanish woman, which he's kind of exoticized, or on the left, this is called Customs House, Santiago de Cuba, where Homer focuses on the Spanish colonial architecture, the presence of the Spanish colonial flag. And in the background, I hope you can make out that these are little soldiers with bayonets, and backing up Homer's observation that Cuba was a red hot place full of soldiers, kind of on the brink of something profound and history altering. Just showing you one more later work from the watercolor from Homer's time in the Bahamas. This is the Turtle Pound from the late 1890s. Homer visits Bahamas 15 years later, continuing to paint the daily lives of the Bahamians at work. And this is just an absolutely gorgeous, dazzling sheet, the bright blues of the water, the luscious sky and the clouds, and his focus on these two figures as they're moving a turtle that they've captured into a holding pound. And would just point out that Homer, I think, is commenting on, again, the history of the region, referencing colony and empire. Turtles were traditional food of the West Indies, but over the course of the 19th century become a luxury item for export, captured and sent across the ocean to restaurants in the Northeast for turtle soup, or across the ocean to England. And I think it's hard not to see them as a symbol of empire in these works. At the heart of our show is Homer's Gulf Stream painting. And we're thinking about how so many of the watercolors that he does in the Bahamas and the tropics lead up and culminate in this painting. And Homer, also at the core of the show, is this tiny little sketch that is from a sketchbook, a page that's just ripped out. And we very much purposefully left this little tattered edge so you could kind of sense the origins of this drawing. This seems to be Homer's first record of the scene that inspires the Gulf Stream painting. And this is from a sketchbook that he used while traveling between the Bahamas and Cuba in 1885. And you see the one boat in distress with maybe one or two figures on it. And just pointing out that the Gulf Stream painting is not realized until almost 15 years later. So that he's kind of cogitating and thinking about this painting across these key decades of his career. And on the lower right now, you see a watercolor also from this 1885 trip, where he's kind of experimenting with compositions and integrating different elements as he later kind of builds up to this painting. After his second trip to the Bahamas in 1898-99, Homer returns to his studio and writes his dealer, "I'm beginning this great painting from sketches that I made in the Bahamas." And this watercolor seems to show him experimenting with his early compositions. The painting is really painted very quickly in 1899, in the fall of 1899. And as we've said, it's this epic saga, this scene of distress set on the Gulf Stream, the great Atlantic current in the Caribbean. And Homer is really creating a modern history painting. He focuses on the power of the current, but he fills it with really important details, details that point to the legacy of the Gulf Stream and the legacy of slavery. Homer, in speaking about this painting, is really adamant that the subject of this picture is the Gulf Stream itself. And yet in the details, he reveals really, really important elements of history. And of course, at the center of the composition, these bright green stalks of sugarcane really link the painting to the Caribbean and of course to slavery. Sugarcane being one of the main commodities of slavery, harvested by enslaved people, sent across the ocean, abetted by the Gulf Stream current itself. Homer also, these ferocious swarming sharks, also have really powerful symbolism to the Middle Passage. And in Homer's day, it was well known that sharks often followed slave ships because enslaved Africans were often thrown overboard and fed to these sharks, a really horrifying history. So Homer has kind of filled the painting with these details. And of course, at the heart, a Black protagonist. Interestingly, when Homer first shows the painting in 1899, before the exhibition, he sends it to an exhibition in Philadelphia, and before the exhibition is even finished, Homer writes to his dealer, send the painting back to the studio. I want to paint on it some more. Oh, sorry, I missed this detail of our hero on the deck of the boat. And here's a photograph of how the painting first looked when it was exhibited. And Homer makes a number of edits to the painting over the following years. So you'll notice if you look at the deck of the boat, that there's no sail and the side of the boat is completely intact. But the most important change is here on the horizon, where you see that Homer adds a boat, a possible source of rescue. And this edit was really made in response to criticism of the painting. It hadn't found a purchaser after its first exhibition, but also this was a painting that people found very, very upsetting, disconcerting. They were concerned about the fate of this man. And in fact, people wrote to Homer's, inquiring about the fate of this man. And Homer famously wrote a very snarky reply to those who inquired. He writes, you can tell these school marms that are the unfortunate man who is by now parboiled is rescued by the passing ship, returned to his family, and lives happily ever after. So Homer seems to have added the boat on the horizon as a possible source of rescue around this time. And of course, the joke is sort of on us that just because the boat is there does not mean that he is rescued. And so in a way, Homer has almost heightened the tension, and he very much wants this to be a painting of unknown outcomes of discomfort. At the same time, this is a painting that is very much in a great art historical tradition. Homer invokes the painting by the great British artist Turner's Slave Ship, comparing it in scale and subject matter to his epic saga. But he also certainly knew paintings such as Jericho's Raft of the Medusa or John Singleton Copley's Watson and the Shark, which both show epic scenes of distress with Black protagonists. Homer's only other major painting of the Caribbean, which he saw as a pendant to the Gulf Stream, is this Searchlight on a Harbor, Santiago de Cuba, painted around the same time. And Homer here is kind of making a modern history painting of the Spanish-American War, where he is contrasting the Spanish 17th century fort and cannon against the modern technology of the US Navy. In this case, the modern searchlights, which were used to blockade the Spanish fleet in Santiago Harbor. And he turns it into this really evocative moonlight scene. Homer spends the last decades of his life really focusing on the power of the sea and painting the view outside of his studio at the coast of Maine under varying conditions of weather and time, different seasons. And this is Northeaster, where he really peels away all the narrative details to focus on the power of nature and the drama of this winter storm. And these are some of his best known works. His last oil painting is this Driftwood, which is really, I think, a meditation on end of life and mortality, where we see this lone fisherman or sailor, or another surrogate figure attempting to pull this huge piece of driftwood from the ocean. And I think the powerful sense that in the end, it's nature that remains. And Homer is showing us the winter storm, the expansiveness of the sea. And I'm very much struck by his awe of nature, his reverence of nature. This is a painting, as I said, from the end of his life, finished in 1909. But in the prior decade, he had really kind of ruminated. Right before his birthday, he wrote this remarkable letter where he says, The life I have chosen gives me full hours of enjoyment. For the balance of my life, the sun will not rise or set without my notice and thanks. And I think this respect for nature and this gratitude of nature and awe really comes through in these works. And we end the show with some paintings that really focus on the theme of mortality. And I realize that I'm going on too long and I want to have time for Q&A. So I'll just move through these very quickly. This is a hunting scene right and left where Homer's showing us the remarkable moments as these two ducks are being shot. Kind of the duck on the right has just been shot. The duck on the left is about to be shot. And if we zoom in on the detail, we see the hunters behind the duck firing his rifle, and we, the viewer, are poised directly across from that gunshot. It's a remarkable painting, kind of part still life, part Audubon print, but one that really, again, ruminates on these moments between life and death. And finally, one of Homer's most, I think, remarkable paintings, certainly most ambitious and the largest one he ever painted, is the fox hunt, a winter scene on the coast of Maine, which represents a phenomenon apparently that happens where there's a kind of inversion in the natural order of things, where what we would think of maybe as the predator becomes the prey. And we see a flock of crows, known as a murder, going after this fox who's been weakened by the long winter and the snow. A coastal scene, probably a nocturne, a remarkable composition where the fox has almost become anthropomorphized as we're sort of at his level, looking at the back of his head as this flock of crows seems to set in. And this remarkable composition, the broad expanse of snow, the one spot of red in the snow of these berries, which they're probably battling for. Remarkably, Homer's signature in the lower left corner mimics the pose of the fox. He kind of playfully sets it sinking into the snow, but also kind of allows us to speculate and ruminate on his identification with this creature. And this is a painting of the 1890s, but really shows his fascination with the struggle of nature, Darwinian themes, and mortality, and really profound themes that cross his career. And I will end there because I as I said, I want to have time for questions. It's just lovely to spend time with you, and I could go on and on about these wonderful paintings, but I do hope you'll have some questions. Thank you so much.
Hello again. There are some very interesting questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to start with the most potentially complex of them, but it has to do with something that you, Stephanie, alluded to toward the end. It has to do with, oops, I've just lost contact here or something. All right, that's better. And that has to do with the painting of the Gulf Stream in the Met's collection. And so the question is, well, Stephanie referred to the painting as part of a legacy of slavery, a legacy of the period of slavery in the United States, with the sugarcane, detail of sugarcane in the boat. And the question is, could we understand that painting as an allegory of the broken promise or the end of the promise of Reconstruction, that is, of freedom and equality for African Americans, especially former enslaved people? And the subset of that question is, would the doomed sailor in the boat even have understood, if he'd seen the ship on the horizon, would he have understood that as a source of salvation, or would he be cynical about that possibility? So take it, Stephanie.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, I mean, in this moment that he's painting the Gulf Stream at the very end of the 19th century, the dawn of the 20th century is a moment, is really kind of the nadir, known as the nadir of race relations in the United States. This is around the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Which, you know, absolutely, I think Homer is commenting on the just the failure of, I mean, the abandonment of Reconstruction, the really dire situation. And, you know, as for the protagonist in the painting, right, it's, you know, it's impossible to read him, right? It can be interpreted in so many ways. His gesture, his expression, you know, some people see it as kind of stoic resolve. But yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent observation, right? That he may not have seen it as salvation, right? You know, that, and similarly, would that boat even stop for him, right? The tension is central to the painting, and the uncertainty is absolutely central to the painting.
And the echo with Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, I think, is very productive here, because the subtext or the allegory of the Raft of the Medusa is the failure of the French government.
Right.
And seeing the ship is like seeing the official, you know, the state coming to the rescue, and maybe that wasn't going to happen. So I find this interesting resonance with an earlier example of a marine painting of marooned people, including a black man,
right,
not being saved by the powers that be. So here's another question that has to do with reception. Was Homer appreciated in his lifetime? Was there a substantial market for his work?
He was appreciated in his lifetime. And I would say that across his career, you know, there are these kind of landmark moments and works that establish him and then move his career forward. So a work like Prisoners from the Front in the 1860s is kind of a benchmark that is then surpassed by Breezing Up. And there are these moments that, you know, he's getting critical acclaim and recognition. Obviously, not all of his works are universally kind of loved and adored. And the Gulf Stream is an example of one that was difficult and kind of not accepted right away. He is selling his works fairly early on. So he's born in 1836. His first work to enter a public collection is The Fox Hunt, the work we just looked at. So that goes to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in the 1890s. So museums are buying his works while he's still alive, and his watercolors sell well. I mean, there is a commercial aspect to his work. He was very sensitive to the market, responding to the market, and watercolors were something that he could sell, as he said, at a price that people were willing to pay. So he was appreciated during his lifetime and fairly commercially successful.
Here's a challenging question, an open-ended question. I'm going to distill it. Was Homer principally or primarily an optimist or a pessimist about American life and American conditions?
Gosh, that's a hard one.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, you know, I've wondered if Homer didn't have some kind of form of PTSD from the war, and that kind of shaped him. Gosh, that is a hard question. I do, you know, I would tend to think he was sort of a kind of realist, sort of fatalist, right? So maybe more, you know, that I think for him, it was nature. Nature was relenting and was going to triumph. And, you know, there are hints of optimism, but I don't know. I'm sure.
Yeah, I think fatalism is and you know, reality embracing is probably a good response. Okay, I think I'm meant to ask the final question now. And it is, Homer lived in New York, but did he paint urban scenes?
No, he really did not.
I didn't think so, yeah.
Yeah, so, and it's, you know, in this moment in the late 19th century, as you know, it's, you know, many artists are really focused on rural life, but Homer really does not paint it. You see it a little bit in his prints, but he's really avoiding it and focusing on nature. And, you know, there's so many moments in his work. I would even just add at Trout's Neck, where he lives, you know, that was really a vibrant summer community with tennis courts and golf courses and things, you know, and Homer and his family helped develop that landscape. But he's not painting that either, right? He's really focusing on nature and shifting away from it. And that's my My dog's saying hello. I hope that's not too distracting.
That's your dog saying that it's 6 o'clock.
Yes.
That's our alarm.
Yes.
Until Mary comes back, I'm going to put in one more question. So speaking of his family, he traveled so much. What impact did that have on his family life?
Yeah, so Homer never married, had no children. And, I think obviously it made it easier for him to kind of move around. He has a reputation that he cultivated for being a kind of hermit loner, but the truth is somewhere in between. I mean, he did have relationships with his siblings and family and friends and was part of an artistic community. But we don't know very much about his personal life, and there has been speculation that he had his heart broken by a woman, but also speculation that he was gay. So
yeah, the confirmed bachelor model.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, Mary Ray is back, so we take it over to her.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi, thank you all so much. Stephanie and John, thank you so much for today's presentation and discussion. I hope you saw some of the comments in the chat because they're all very positive, and I know we could probably be on here for another couple of hours with all these questions. So I love the enthusiasm from all our attendees. And of course, it was very educational and informative. So thank you both. And for the attendees, we encourage you all to visit the exhibition at the Met, 5th Avenue through July 31st. So you have some time to go. And to our audience, thank you very much for joining today. We look forward to seeing you all at future virtual programs. And please visit the link in the chat to view the calendar of upcoming events. So have a great night.